Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to be talking about the aftermath of the Peace of Paris and how the British government attempted to recoup some of their financial losses from their North American colonies, which theoretically the war was fought to benefit, and how the colonies responded somewhat disproportionately, or maybe proportionately, we'll figure it out, to the threat of increasing British taxes. So, that'll be exciting. We're going to talk about the reasons which salutary neglect ended and the responses of the American colonists to specific acts of the British government, and then the effect of this whole process on the way the American colonies viewed themselves as part of the British Empire. So, let's dive in. As you hopefully remember from last time, the French and Indian War was a victory for the British, but was spectacularly expensive. We can see here the British Lion being held hostage by a combination of colonists and Native Americans, Pontiac especially here. We can also see that the British Lion has been losing his paws in order to try to pay for the war in America. And at this point, the British budget, more than half of it was paid just to service the debt, not even to pay it down, just to pay the interest on the debt, which would made it relatively hard for the British government to operate and do their basic sort of functions. And so, obviously, this is not a tenable solution over the long term, and so something has to change. And so the British government, specifically the Board of Trade, kept coming up with new and creative ways to try to raise revenue. So, for example, the Revenue Act was passed in 1762, before the Peace of Paris was even signed. The Revenue Act was an acknowledgement that the whole salutary neglect thing wasn't super working, because the British were collecting approximately £2,000 in duties per year, when they should have been collecting just from molasses upwards of £200,000. So there's a slight discrepancy there. And the colonists might have been doing a small amount of smuggling. And so, the British decided that maybe it's time to actually start collecting some of these taxes that they hadn't been collecting before. So George Grenville became the prime minister, and he's the one who passed this Revenue Act, which included a whole bunch of different things. A lot of it was about collection of taxes and cracking down on smuggling. The British used writs of assistance to crack down on smugglers, which were more or less blank search warrants that were given out to customs officials, where they could write in the name of whatever they wanted to search and then just break in and search it, regardless of any sort of information, prior cause, stuff like that. The goal, of course, was to catch smugglers, but for the American colonists, this was especially outrageous because they felt like their rights of British citizens were being trampled upon. So they wrote a series of pamphlets, the most famous of which is The Rights of the British Colonists Asserted and Proved by James Otis, which railed against the British for violating their rights as Americans through these writs of assistance and through the creation of special courts called Courts of Admiralty, wherein smugglers were tried not by the colonial officials, who, as we talked about before, were spectacularly lax on the issue of smuggling, but instead were tried by British military courts, which tended to find the smugglers guilty at a much higher rate, which I'm sure is shocking to you. Then we got the Sugar Act, which was an attempt to refine the Molasses Act. It was technically a tax cut. It cut the tax of molasses in half, from 6 cents a barrel down to 3 cents a barrel. But it also increased enforcement of the molasses tax. And the problem for the colonists, for the British, they figured, hey, we're providing a tax cut. Now more merchants are going to use legal means and legal avenues to get their molasses to market. But for the colonists, they had been used to paying a 1.5 cent bribe to customs officials. So this 3 cent tax felt like a tax increase, despite the fact that it was actually a tax cut. So this change in expectations between the two sides led the Sugar Act to be incredibly unpopular and led to significant colonial resistance. They also passed the Currency Act, which prevented the colonies from creating their own paper money, which was generally backed by nothing and often inflated to worthlessness incredibly quickly. The colonists attempted to pay some of these British taxes in their own currency, but the Currency Act prevented this from happening. Here you can see an incredibly official-looking £5 note from New York Colony. In addition to this, they passed what's called the Quartering Act of 1764-1765, which stated that the popular understanding of the Quartering Act is like a British soldier's hanging out in your room and sleeping in your bed. This was not what the Quartering Act did. It made colonial governments provide lodging for British soldiers. So it's an informal tax because obviously they have to raise that money from somewhere if they're going to provide lodging. And so it put the burden of housing all of these troops, which the British argued, hey, they're there for your benefit anyway, on the colonists instead of on the British government. The colonists were wary about this, both because, as Englishmen, they're wary about standing armies because they've read the history of the English Civil War and they know that standing armies tend to, overthrow governments and seize power, and because they felt like it was a tax being imposed upon them from England. So, for example, the New York Assembly refused to allocate money, and Parliament revoked their charter and took away their self-government. Generally, all the colonies tried to avoid this, and the British tried to crack down upon it, and it led to significant tension between the two sides. But when things really boiled over and the height of tension hit was this thing called the Stamp Act. Contrary to what your elementary school teachers told you, it was not a tax on stamps. The Stamp Act was a tax on paper. It was a tax on paper that had been passed throughout the entire British government and was active in England and Ireland and all the other British domains. And it was relevant because in order for any contract to be legal, in order for a newspaper to be signed, in order for any treaty or anything else to be legal, it had to have this stamp on it, which is provided by the British government in order to tax this paper. The colonists responded incredibly angrily to the passage of the Stamp Act because, again, going back to the aftermath of the Dominion of New England, the colonies had asserted that they had the only and exclusive right to tax. And so they began protesting. Newspaper printers obviously very against it for what I hope are obvious reasons. We also get some anti-Stamp Act commemorative pottery here, which is super exciting. Virginia passed what's called the Virginia Resolves, stating that, quote, the General Assembly of this colony have the only and sole exclusive right and power to lay taxes and impositions upon the inhabitants of this colony, and that every attempt to vest such power in any person or persons, whoever other than the General Assembly aforesaid, has the manifest tendency to destroy British as well as American freedom. So the Virginia wrote a strongly worded letter condemning the Stamp Act. Famously, a fiery House of Burgesses representative named Patrick Henry may have also said, quote, Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III, may he profit by their example, thereby implying that the same way that Caesar was killed by Brutus and Charles I was killed by Cromwell, that George III might be killed by us for making us buy stamped paper. Seems proportional. Boston, of course, got even more freaked out about this. The merchants of Boston, already outraged over the crackdowns on smuggling, really went over the top as far as the whole Stamp Act thing. They started organizing themselves into groups to organize resistance, known as the Sons of Liberty, organized specifically by a guy named Sam Adams, who was an occasional brewer and sort of polymath, and also agitator, and the merchant and occasional smuggler John Hancock. These guys organized massive protests, more or less threatening anyone who wanted to work for the British government and distribute the stamped paper. And so, quote, the Secretary of Province, who was appointed the Stamp Master, was attacked and his house was much damaged. He was carried to the Liberty Tree by a mob, and a justice of the peace provided to swear him, and there he was obliged, upon pain of death, to take an oath to resign his office. This tree stood in the town and was consecrated as an idol for the mob to worship. It was properly the tree ordeal, where those whom the rioters pitched upon as state delinquents were carried for trial or brought for a test of political orthodoxy. So, the Stamp Act was never going to go into place in Massachusetts because they couldn't find anyone to work as stamp collectors. And as part of these Stamp Act riots, quote unquote, they threatened to hang people from the Liberty Tree, and they burned down the governor, Thomas Hutchinson's house. So, Virginia writes a strongly worded letter, Massachusetts threatens to hang you in effigy and burns down the governor's house. And as a response to this, here's the burning of the governor's house. As a response to this, England realized that the Stamp Act was probably going to be unenforceable. It hadn't actually even gone into effect yet. It had just been leaked to the colonists that they had been planning on doing it, and the stamped paper had never arrived. But these are just two examples, of course. Other colonies had other anti-Stamp Act demonstrations. And the colonies all got together to form what's called the Stamp Act Congress, where 9 colonies sent delegates to New York. This is the first mass meeting of multiple colonies together to organize resistance. They drafted a petition to the king, and they declared that they were going to start boycotting British products if the Stamp Act ever went into effect. In order to organize and carry out these boycotts, they created what are called committees of correspondence, which are committees of leading members of society that work sort of as a shadow legislature in case the actual legislature is shut down. They make decisions, they appoint local officers, they threaten to hang people and tar and feather them if they go against what the majority wants. And it's basically a way for the colonists to start exerting even more control outside of the traditional power structures which the British could theoretically shut down. The threat of boycott was finally effective, so the Americans, as they threatened to not use British goods, the British decided to repeal the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act never was enforced, the stamp paper never arrived in the colonies, but this didn't solve the central problem, namely the central problem being the British government was still broke. So, in response to this, the king and Parliament, more than the king, of course, because, the king at this point in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution is mostly a figurehead, so we don't have to really worry about him. The king and Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, which said that, yes, they repealed the Stamp Act, but not because they didn't have the right to tax the colonies. They did have the right to tax the colonies. They're just choosing not to tax the colonies right now. But later they could tax them if they wanted. And the colonies do have representation in Parliament. It's something called virtual representation, in which every member of the British Empire is theoretically represented by every member of Parliament. And of course, for their arguments, they pointed to all the rotten boroughs in Parliament, where like 10 people are choosing MPs, and that most Britons didn't have the right to vote anyway. So, yes, you have representation. Yes, you have to pay your taxes. We're not going to make you pay the Stamp Act, but it's not because you won the argument. It's because of another reason that we're not going to talk about right now. So, that's the Declaratory Act. The end result of this is the committees of correspondence now had groups like the Loyal Nine and the Sons of Liberty, these popular mobs where the people like Sam Adams and John Hancock could stir up into a frenzy to go and tar and feather people, hang them in effigy, threaten British officials, and more or less enforce their will upon anyone else in society. And so these groups became the core of resistance to future British policies and created a framework by which the colonies could work together towards their common cause of not allowing the British to do anything to them. So that's the first wave of radicalism. This is the Stamp Act and the end result. So hopefully you can answer these questions in some detail. And for next time, we'll talk about the British trying to still solve the central problem of how do we deal with the fact that we're broke. Thanks for listening.